Niall Ferguson is here. He is an economic historian. He is a professor at Harvard University. He's a former history professor at Oxford University. His opinions on subjects ranging from colonialism to the economic crisis have been met with great discussion and controversy. His new book, Civilization, considers Western civilization's rise to global dominance and its future. I am pleased to have Niall Ferguson at this table. Tell me, is it over for us?
Not necessarily, but I tell you what is over,
Yes.
and that's Western predominance. I think that assumption that guys like us should rule the world, which has been around a long time, I think that's over. And when you consider that it was 500 years in the making, that basically for half a millennium, people like us got richer, more powerful, taller, healthier than everybody else, I think that's over. I think in that sense we're entering a new era in which there won't be a natural Western ascendancy that people like us sort of take for granted.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Is it over? Not that it's over, but in a sense is the ascendancy. We are now being challenged by, I assume we'd say, the East.
Yeah, but also the South. I mean, this is not just a story, I think, about
East-West.
China. It's also a story about countries like Brazil.
It's about emerging.
It's about the rest, which is why I very deliberately didn't say the West and the East. It's about everybody else. I mean, it's a minority of mankind, the West. You know, it's less than a fifth and falling. It'll soon be barely 10% of humanity. And what's fascinating about our time, because this is all happening in our generation, is that starting from the late 1970s, the rest really started to narrow the gap. As a simple way of putting this is that in 1978, the average American was 20 times richer than the average Chinese. And now it's less than 5 times. And the gap is narrowing fast.
And in 10 years, they'll have a larger economy than we do.
Maybe in 5 years. IMF thinks it's in 5 years, which is...
The IMF thinks it's in 5 years?
Yeah,
But
2016.
here's what's interesting, and I knew this because of you. It was not inevitable that the West would have the dominance that it had, the ascendancy, was it?
Not at all. And indeed, if you'd gone on a world tour in 1411, 600 years ago, you would not have backed the West. You wouldn't have been impressed at all by the rather little smelly towns of Western Europe. You'd have been far more impressed by Ming, Nanjing, or indeed you'd have been more impressed by the Ottoman Empire.
The Ottoman Empire.
Right.
Yeah.
So in fact, the interesting thing about this is it's a rather surprising thing that happens after 1500, that the small warring kingdoms of Western Europe take over the world. And understanding why that happened is the real point of the book. That's the #1 question, because it's so unlikely. If you think of what England was like in the early 15th century, riven by civil strife, racked by periodic plagues, with a homicide rate, even in Oxford, where I used to teach, higher than anywhere in the world today, it's just astonishing that these societies, which then looked pretty dysfunctional, ended up producing the scientific revolution. They ended up producing the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, and ultimately the empires that by the mid-20th century dominated everybody else.
But your central point here is that the rest went to school on our experience. They learned from our apps.
Yeah. So I tried to explain Western ascendancy in terms of killer apps, which sounds rather facile, but it's not a bad metaphor, because what I'm really talking about are ideas and institutions, things that, man-made things that changed behavior. And for 500 years, things like, the scientific revolution or the work ethic or the consumer society, these things were pretty much monopolized by Western societies, by Europe, North America, Australasia. In our time, the real story is that our killer apps have been downloaded by the rest. It was open access software.
They went to school on us.
Yeah. The Japanese were the first to do it, and they started quite a long time ago. So Meiji Japan in the late 19th century systematically copies Western institutions, and this works. But it's only really been in our time that the big populous countries, China, India, Brazil, Indonesia, have sat down and said, look, we can do this too. We can have the same kind of science and technology education as them. We can have the same economic model as them.
But the shortening of, distance and time made it easier for them to do it, did it not? Because of the technological innovations, time and distance became much shorter.
Technology makes it very easy to disseminate knowledge, but that's not so new. After all, when the Industrial Revolution happened, within a very short space of time, North Americans copied the technology that the British had come up with. So in the sense that there's a sort of piracy process at work here, where good ideas get copied, good technology gets replicated. I don't think we're seeing anything that new. But yeah, the speed at which this is happening is amazing. I think that's why most people find it a little hard to believe. There's a lot of denial out there. You know, you'll hear fairy stories, often in the United States, sometimes in Europe. For example, oh, the future will be just like your iPhone. It will be designed by Apple in California and just assembled in China. In other words, they can't really do innovation.
They don't have the ideas.
And that's not true anymore. I mean, it isn't true. Measurably, it's not true, because if you look at the number of patents that are granted every year internationally, Japan has been in the lead for some time.
But
South Korea is gaining.
Okay, Japan stumbled. Why did Japan stumble?
That's a really interesting question, because in a way it's tempting to say, well, that's what will happen to China too. But I think Japan's troubles are very peculiar to Japan. It's a population that has aged faster than anywhere else, partly because of the success of their post-war welfare state, partly because they just don't have immigration worth talking about. So you have a very rapid aging, combined, of course, with institutions that they had copied from the West, including a welfare state that ultimately has been very hard to maintain with this aging population structure. And there were mistakes in the banking system in the late 1980s and early 1990s, which in fact sound quite familiar from our vantage point. Japan's lost 2 decades started with a real estate bubble, and then with zombie banks, and then there followed a giant explosion of public debt.
And there's some fear that there's a real estate bubble in China.
Yeah, well, there certainly was, though nothing on the scale of Japan in the 1980s.
And they recognized it, too. I mean, there was a recognition by the government of we're at risk here.
Absolutely, and what we've seen in the last year has been a sustained attempt by the Chinese authorities to deflate that bubble. It's quite interesting, in fact. While we've all been focused on Europe in the last few weeks, China has been finding it harder than I think the Beijing authorities expected to bring this under control. Property prices are falling a bit faster than they expected, and it turns out that they have their shadow banking institutions rather on the US model, which are going bust on a pretty large scale.
And hedge funds. And
I mean, and off-balance sheet vehicles with funny names and things that just weren't regulated. That's all been going on in China in the last few years, since they used their monetary stimulus, their enormous expansion of bank lending, to cope with our crisis. So one thing this book is not saying is that China's going to take over the world, it's a slam dunk, and we should all just pack our bags and head for Hong Kong. I think it's very clear that China has major problems in the pipeline: demographic, environmental, and short-term.
Demographic means they don't have enough young people.
Well, the one-child policy,
policy.
yeah, the one-child policy has created 2 big problems. The population's aging, but there's an enormous gender imbalance. There'll be 22 million men without women in the generation that is currently
kids. What social tension will that create?
That's a really interesting question, because there aren't many precedents in history for this. But men without women, if you remember Hemingway's short story collection of that name, and they tend to be quite violent. I was very struck. I was in Zambia recently, earlier this year, looking at China's empire in Africa, trying to understand it. A lot of young men from China are in Africa at the moment trying to make money. They don't plan to stay there. But they'll tell you, oh, I can make 3 times here in Zambia what I make back in China. If I stay here working 7 days a week for 2 or 3 years and then go back, I've got a better chance with the girls. That's a fascinating story, don't you think?
Yeah, indeed. But I also know people in the United States thinking, if I was living my life over, I'd move to China after getting my diploma.
One of the questions that I get from Harvard students these days is, you know, what do I do next? Because it's no longer self-evident.
These are history students or your business school students?
History students, actually. It's no longer, for the undergraduates, it's no longer immediately obvious that they should go to business school. Increasingly, they're saying, well, should I be, learning Chinese? Should I be heading to Asia?
And what do you say?
Well, one way of answering this question is to say, look, what made the West very successful included very, very good institutions. The rule of law was better here than elsewhere, and therefore it was a better place to start a business. That's no longer true. One of the things that really blew me away recently was when I looked at the measures of the efficiency of the rule of law that you can actually get out there from the World Economic Forum. The US actually performs pretty miserably by these measures. I think it's in 15 out of 16 measures of the effectiveness of the rule of law. The US isn't even in the top 20 in the world. And Hong Kong is.
What do we mean by the rule of law, though, in this case?
Right, so this is a really interesting question, because this is one of my killer apps. This is one of the things that really sets the West apart from the rest, and the North of America.
Rule of law.
Yeah, and the rule of law was a very specific thing. It was based on private property rights and their protection by representative assemblies, which represented property owners from arbitrary intervention by sovereigns. Investors were protected. If you bought a house, you could be confident that you wouldn't have it taken away from you. That sort of thing. And in a more sophisticated way, the state existed to protect you from crime. Now, the rule of law in that sense used to be something that the West did much better than everybody else on both sides of the Atlantic. I don't think that's true anymore. One of the things that really startled me when I started looking at these measures of the effectiveness of the rule of law was that we've got worse at this, even as they've been getting better.
But what does it mean to get worse at the rule of law?
So here's a specific instance. Although many people, conservatives in this country, worry about big government, they don't worry enough about big law. Because the costs on a new business in this country don't just come in the form of taxes and regulations. They come in the form of lawyers' bills. Right. You know, what does the compliance department say? Oh, you better go and ask the lawyers. This conversation about compliance with complex regulation, think of the 2,000-page Dodd-Frank bill that just emerged
before
from Washington.
that was the other.
And Sarbanes-Oxley before that.
Right.
It's getting more and more difficult to be an entrepreneur in this country. That's the harsh truth. The small businesses and the startups that, generally speaking, generate jobs are weighed down with some very, very complex regulation, and I would call these the sort of hidden costs of a dysfunctional rule of law. It's worse in other countries. Italy, for example, is far worse.
But at the same time, we also need to be conscious of the fact that we do want and need important regulations. We want to know that that the food we eat is healthy. We want to know that the planes we get on will be safe. And we want to know a whole bunch of things that only government does.
And Adam Smith, who in many ways is one of the presiding geniuses over this book, I mean, it's Smith's idea of the wealth of nations, which is at the back of what I'm talking about. Smith understood this, and he was very alert to the need for regulation. But regulation doesn't need to be hugely complicated. In fact, the simpler it is, the more transparent it is, the more likely it is to be effective. I think we've forgotten that.
Yeah.
I think we have lost sight of that, and we've come to believe that complexity is good. And it's a rather simplistic reading of the last 20 or 30 years to say, well, all our problems today happen because of deregulation, so let's have a lot of regulation and things will be better. Apart from anything else, I don't remember the 1970s going that brilliantly under a much more, under a much simpler, but yet quite burdensome system of regulation.
Some argue, not some, I've at least read one, that said, where is the conversation about morality in this book?
I think there is a significant theme in the book which is concerned with the impact of Protestantism and its distinctive morality
because it's
on the
work
great
ethic?
divergence. Partly because of the work ethic, partly also because of the thrift ethic, which is the part that we've perhaps slightly lost sight of.
Or not slightly.
But also the core of Luther's teaching, what made the difference, I think, in the early 16th century in Europe was the idea that you, as an individual, were responsible to God and you needed to read the scripture yourself. You couldn't sort of outsource it to a priest. That turns out to matter a lot. And I should stress that I myself am not a religious person, but it matters a lot because once you have people reading the Bible in their own language, they can read anything. And so I came to realize that it's not so much the Protestant work ethic that matters, it's the Protestant word ethic. So that's I think, the moral dimension of the story. Now, there's another way of putting this, which is to say that I don't lament enough the fact that the West got so much richer than the rest and more powerful than the rest. Though I do a fair bit of lamentation, talking, for example, about the way in which ideas of empire shaded into ideas of eugenics and racial superiority. The book is very explicitly negative and hostile towards racial explanations of the great divergence between East and West.
But will China, for just take one example, will the velocity of their ascension be slowed by on the one hand, censorship, human rights, transparency?
Yeah. I think the big difference between what China's doing and what the West did is that there's a killer app missing. The rule of law, private property rights, you will look for these things in vain. And more broadly speaking, intellectual freedom, freedom of inquiry, freedom of expression, all of these are circumscribed in a one-party state. Now, the Chinese will say, look, we're doing something you never tried to do. We're trying to govern a fifth of humanity under one system.
1 billion and 3 people.
Right. And therefore, don't judge us by the standards of the United States or, for that matter, Denmark.
Does that argument ring true to you, that somehow we should give them some slack because they're 1.3 billion people?
I think there's some truth to it. If you spend time there, you're struck by the sheer, almost overwhelming challenge that
Is
their
state
leaders
capitalism
face.
then the only system that would work there?
No, I don't think so. I think one of the lessons of, indeed, recent Chinese history is that the less the state plays a role in economic life, the better the economy does. And in some ways, I think this idea of state capitalism is a bit of a caricature, because the state plays a bigger role in the European economies than it does in China today.
Yeah, but that's in terms of entitlements. You're talking about this sort of social democratic model of a welfare state.
Just the size
of a welfare state.
So the size of government
and
in
the reason you have
to
the
GDP.
savings rate in places like China and Japan is that there had not been a safety net, and therefore they saved in order to protect themselves.
That's right, but there's another reason for it, which is
and then you have the children to take care of them, not the government.
That's right, but that's not going to be true in the next generation
because of the one-child
policy.
Right.
So they do have these problems, and yet somehow it seems to me a bigger problem for them is that they cannot fully unleash the creativity of their citizens without the security that is offered by Western institutions. The freedom, but also the security. What makes the rule of law distinctive in the West is that it creates freedom that is both economic and political, not to mention religious. And I suppose the conclusion I came to as I was summing the book up was that the institutions that interest me matter because they essentially allow for human freedom. And from that freedom comes the creativity that solves the problems that
What institutions are you talking about?
Everything from the market economy to the rule of law, through our educational system with its emphasis on scientific research as well as the humanities. The institutions are the thing that transmit our values from generation to generation, but they also preserve our freedoms, and that the Chinese don't yet have.
Okay, let me turn to Europe for a second, because you are a historian, as not just of East-West. What's the threat, as you see it today, of the inability so far to deal with the debt crisis?
It's very grave. We are...
I mean, serious people keep saying that. We think of it, well, they'll just muddle their way through. But more and more, I'm talking to serious people who say, maybe not.
Well, I was one of the serious people who...
From Spain and Italy, you're talking about a much larger economy. You're talking about a $1 trillion economy versus a...
Well, there are two things. I was one of the people, we were a minority, who said this wouldn't work 12 years ago. I strongly argued against a single currency.
Oh, yes, you did, I know.
And monetary union always struck me as a recipe for trouble.
Right.
Because if you just unite the currencies but nothing else, not the fiscal systems, you're really bound to hit some kind of collision. And we got there.
Go ahead, tell us what it means in terms of not having the ability to print money, number one.
This can sound a little technical, so let me put it in the most straightforward terms.
That I can understand.
Well, that I can understand,
Yes.
my students can understand, and my kids can understand. So the key here is that if you create a single currency, it's very important that you should have some mechanism for transferring resources from the more productive places to the less productive ones, because the less productive ones have lost the option to devalue, to have a weaker currency. Right. No such mechanism was set up when the euro was established. The only thing that was really said was there would be one interest rate, one money, and nobody leaves. You're not allowed to exit. So the other problem is that there was no natural integration of the labour market that was created. In fact, the labour market diverged. The cost of labour in Germany was held quite steady. Everybody else went on a kind of spree, a wage spree.
Are you also saying, though, that if they'd been able to overcome those impediments, you would have been in favour of it?
Yeah, well, I would not have been so hostile to the idea if they had recognized.
But not necessarily.
I was never a big fan of it, and I certainly opposed British membership.
Suppose there was a European political union and a European monetary union and a European fiscal union. Would you say, by God, that's the dream since World War II, and thank God it's happened?
I'm not hostile to the idea of a United States of Europe as long as Britain isn't part of it, because I think that is not compatible with British traditions, both political and, for that matter, economic. And the implications of creating a United States of Europe today, which is what is being discussed as we speak, this is the question. Are you going to have a United States of Europe? And if so, who will run it? It is very clear that the conversation today is essentially about fiscal constraints, rules about budgets that cannot be breached. Who is dictating those terms? Who is insisting that there should be a balanced budget rule, a limit on how much government borrowing there can be? The answer is the German government. Those of us who are always worried about European integration, worried for historical reason. The natural tendency for Germany, the biggest economy, to dominate any federal Europe has manifested itself. Peacefully now, but it's happening, and nobody should deny this. And anybody, if you talk to, whether it's in Greece or in Italy, will admit that's the reality.
What's interesting about Germany is there are people now beginning to say, for a long time we wanted to make sure Germany was not, did not do too much. Now we're worried that they will not do enough because of the power they have.
This is an excellent speech by Radek Sikorski, my old Oxford friend, now the Polish foreign minister.
I think that's why
one of the speeches of the year.
Right.
And it's remarkable to hear a Polish foreign minister urging the Germans to do more.
Right.
But what he, and by the way, the Germans did not like this speech, but what he's saying is that you can't simply say to everybody, you must balance your budget, end of conversation. The Germans still don't recognize that if there's going to be some kind of United States of Europe, they must be ready to transfer resources from productive German taxpayers to less productive people in the Mediterranean periphery. Just as productive Texans today accept that a chunk of their federal taxes will end up in less productive parts of the United States. As long as the Germans want to have, as it were, the benefits of federalism without the costs, power over other countries without the need to give money to them, this thing is not going to be stable, and it's not going to be a source of European harmony. I think it's going to be a source of European friction. I think the euro may survive as a currency because it's hard to kill. I think the European Union in its present form is highly unlikely to exist in 10 years from now. I think Britain will not stick around to be part of a project that essentially is a federal system.
So it gets out of the European Union?
It may well, and it can. That's possible. It's easier to... This is one of the things that people don't
Britain
realise.
leaves and Turkey comes in.
That certainly won't happen. The Turks don't even want that.
Oh, no, I'm not sure that's true.
Well, that's one of the interesting things about Turkey today, and Turkey plays a big part in civilization because, after all, the Ottoman Empire should have done much better than it did. But Turkey today
some argue that the Turks have a vision of reviving
and that's
the Ottoman
happening.
Empire.
That is one of the striking things about Istanbul today. People do not want particularly to be in the EU anymore. That's a 10-year-old idea. Today, they see themselves as a new Ottoman power, extending their influence throughout a greater Middle East and becoming real players in a post-American Middle East.
Well, and the interesting thing is one place where the United States, in the context of the president, the two leaders of Turkey and the United States have actually a very, very good relationship.
Mr. Erdogan is one of the cleverest men in international relations today.
Do you really think so?
Yeah, I think he's extraordinarily clever.
Because he has a vision, and because he has been politically adept in winning elections and
very adept domestically in
making the case for a secular government.
Right. Well, he's certainly not making the case for a secular government. He's making the case for a moderate Islamist form of government, which is very.
Well, he would dramatically disagree that he's not making the case for a secular government. I mean, he makes a speech in Cairo telling them you need a secular government. And the people who objected most to it was the Muslim Brotherhood.
Right.
That's making a case for a secular government.
So I think the difference...
You're saying there's something he's doing.
I think the key to understanding Erdogan's cleverness is that he can talk out of both sides of his mouth and say, on the one hand, we're the most Western-oriented of the powers in this region. On the other hand, when you actually talk to people in Ankara, what is going on here is the dismantling of Ataturk's legacy. I mean, Ataturk's legacy of a secular system of government which clearly separated the Turkish state from Islam is under real threat.
Ataturk's legacy also was a very powerful military, which was prepared to step in if they didn't like the government.
And I think those days are over. I mean, I think he has
That's one of the things he's achieved.
He's emasculated.
That's one of the things he's achieved. But it seems to me the argument has to do more with autocratic power than it does with the desire to create some non-secular Islamist state. I think I do believe that he and those surrounding him may like the idea of certain Islamic traditions in the society, but they don't want to create an Islamist government. They want to create a secular government because they believe in it.
This is the challenge of understanding the
and I'm
Muslim
speaking to a
world
historian from Oxford, and what am I now?
No, but these are really important issues. What's striking about the way Turkey is going is that economically it's very dynamic. They're succeeding economically. Right. This is one of the great success stories. Right. So they seem to be able to have I would say, a declining secular state, an increasingly Islamist polity. with a dynamic market economy. That's quite a feat.
Right.
And people are looking at that all over the Arab world and thinking, I wonder if we can have that.
Is this the model?
And so this is another of the models.
And they are, in fact, arguing that they are the model.
So when we talk about the West and the rest, let's not just talk about China. Let's remember that players like Turkey are going to play an increasingly important role in the 21st century. And they're building on an amazing historical legacy. This is a great civilization.
What role in the future of this century will Iran play?
Well, that could be decided in the next 12 months. Potentially could be decided by military conflict. Iran, I think, teetered on the brink of having a democratic revolution in 2009. Perhaps we missed an opportunity to help it on its way. That's something for future historians to debate.
But that is a mistake that we and others have made in history. I mean, history often offers up the case of someone who, for whatever political reason, was not aware of change that was beneath the surface in a society, and therefore, when it happened, was unprepared for it, and did not know anybody that was involved in it.
I think the opportunity
Iran would be exhibit one.
Right, and the opportunity to harness, let's say, the secular liberal energies that are certainly there in Tehran may have been passed up. We could have had a spring, well, we nearly did have a spring with the Green Revolution, and it was snuffed out.
You mean at the time of the election?
In the summer of '09.
Right.
I mean, that was a historic moment where history failed to turn. It was a turning point that didn't happen. And I think the consequences of that could be very disastrous.
And so that also raises a classic question, too. And it was present at that time. So there were people in the streets protesting an election. And the United States, and this happened in the Arab Spring in the beginning as well. What is your role to do? President Obama obviously did not, according to some of them, go far enough. And I'm now talking about Iran at the time. Right. Should have been more forceful in identifying with the people.
I think
on the other hand, he has a government he has to deal with, which was the Ahmadinejad government.
Well, which he wasn't dealing with at all. I think that the lesson of the Cold War is that we actually did a very good job, mostly covertly, of encouraging anti-communist, dissident elements that ultimately laid the foundation for civil society and a transition to democracy.
And sometimes they were not democratic. I mean, there was also a judgment that we, in a sense, turn our back on democratic revolution because we happen to be friendly with the powers that be.
I think that was true in other parts of the world, but it wasn't true in Europe. I mean, in Eastern Europe, where...
So I'm thinking of the Arab world.
Right, so if you think of
Arab world,
of what happened in 1989 in Europe, we had a very successful spring.
Right.
The East European Spring
when the wall came down.
And a transition to democracy, which has been, in fact, an amazing success.
Well, here's what's interesting.
But it didn't happen by accident, and it didn't happen, so to speak, without our playing a part, because I think we did play an important part in encouraging those elements.
And the Pope did, and everybody else.
Right. And we didn't do that in the North Africans and Middle Eastern world in anything like the same way, and I think that was a missed opportunity.
We think that was because of on one case it was Reagan, on another case it was Obama?
We didn't have a good idea of how to encourage those forces, partly because we didn't believe they were there, or, if you think of the neoconservative vision, we thought that we could sort of parachute our guys in and use military force in a relatively blunt instrument.
At this time, what have been called universal values, that people around the world still look to the United States because of our founding documents, our Bill of Rights and our Constitution, and say, we don't want to be like America in every way, but we do want to believe in those universal values of which America is the best representation today.
And that's part of the story of Western civilization. It's a set of values, but perhaps more importantly, it's a set of institutions that protect those values. And the way that I see it is that it's the institutions that are most easily transplanted. Values vary, cultures are diverse, not everybody wants to be an American. But what everybody, I think, wants to have is the rule of law. What everybody wants to have is security for their families and their property and the freedom to express their thoughts. Those are universal values.
And dignity.
And the essential dignity that is so often lacking in countries that don't have good institutions. And that's why I lay the emphasis more on institutions than on values or culture, because I think these institutions will work anywhere. And that's ultimately a rather optimistic thought. Not only can we make these institutions work better in the West, but we can see others adopt them. They can adopt these institutions without becoming like us. In that sense, they're not a threatening thing in the way that perhaps an idea like the American way of life might be.
The 2 points before you go, because I promise you I'd get you out of here, because you have to be on stage and making a speech somewhere. Across town during holiday traffic.
Yeah, good luck with that, Neil.
Indeed. I make 2 points. That's right. Good luck. Blame me when you get there. Say I try to get out.
I fully intend to.
I know. Don't forget, I have a big megaphone. This book is called For Ayan, soon to be the mother of her first child and your, what, fourth. And we wish her good luck. I hope you'll come back for part 2 of this conversation when we can lure you back to the table, if that's okay.
It'd be a huge pleasure.